Donald Trump's in Asia, where one name dominates talks: North Korea. The US president says patience with Pyongyang and its missile tests is over. What is he able to do, and will he pursue Washington's so-called pivot to Asia? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. Don't underestimate America. Donald Trump's message as he kicked off his 12-day tour of Asia, his first as US president. Trade deals are on the agenda, but one subject overtakes all: tensions with North Korea. Trump began in Japan, a meeting with a man he appears to see as his new best buddy, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, over a lunch of burgers and a round of golf. He addressed US forces at the Yokota Air Base near Tokyo, speaking highly of American dominance, and he promised his troops an upcoming shipment of arms. All this talk about US military superiority is related to the conflict with North Korea. Both Trump and Abe say all options are on the table.
The era of strategic patience is over. Some people said that my rhetoric is very strong, but look what's happened with very weak rhetoric over the last 25 years. Look where we are right now.
There is no point in dialogue for the sake of dialogue with North Korea. Now is the time not for dialogue, but for applying maximum pressure on North Korea. We completely agreed that for North Korea to change its policy, Japan and the US must take leadership in closely collaborating with the international community so that we can enhance the pressure over North Korea through all possible means.
But Trump and Abe's big talk on North Korea could pose problems at the US president's next stop, South Korea. Trump's war of words with North Korea has produced a lot of fear in Seoul. South Korean President Moon Jae-in said this week no military action should be taken without his consent. China is also wrapped up in the North Korea conflict. Trump and President Xi Jinping will have talks. Trump telling China previously it wasn't doing enough to help. In Vietnam, North Korea might take a backseat. Trump's expected to talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific region at an Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, meeting. And then he's off to the Philippines and a meeting with President Rodrigo Duterte. Will they talk trade, military bases, or the war on drugs? This is Trump's longest foreign trip yet. His predecessor, Barack Obama, also spent a lot of time in the region as part of his so-called pivot to Asia. Is Trump planning to continue on that path? Well, let's now bring in our guests. Joining us in Beijing, Einar Tangen, political analyst and advisor to the Chinese government. In Singapore, James Dorsey, senior fellow at the S.Rajartnam School of International Studies. And in Boston, Katherine Moon, professor of Asian Studies at Wellesley College. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Einar Tangen, this is a massive trip for a man who says he doesn't like to take long trips away from home. What sort of statement is it, and to whom?
Well, there's a number of statements. First off, he's happy to be out of Washington, D.C., especially with things unfolding as they have been with his aides and other people within his cabinet. There have been a number of blockbuster revelations. But in terms of this trip, he is trying to deliver, trying to breathe some energy into his kind of moribund lack of ability to get things done in D.C. by, in essence, delivering some red meat to the political base that he treasures. He wants to come to Asia. He wants them to know that he's there to make deals, that he will use his strategic advantage, security, as a blunt instrument in order to get what he wants, which are trade concessions.
So, Katherine Moon, are probably delighted to be on the plane as raised by Einar, but what do you think he's going to find then? What's the message? We know at this stage that the TPP and the pivot are out. The question is, what's in?
Well, Mr. Trump does not have a big vision or a grand strategy for East Asia, so he's focusing on specific deals. Primarily, I think if we look at his success in Japan, it says something. He has been able to get the Japanese government to agree to military sales from the United States, so that's good for U.S. military companies. And also, he got the Japanese government to agree to impose unilateral sanctions on North Korea. So on two things that he cares about, trade as well as North Korea, he has won in Japan already. What is interesting is that the next stops, South Korea, China, will not go as smoothly as it has in Japan. There are many more contentious issues, and South Korea in particular is very wary of Mr. Trump's escalatory rhetoric in the recent months and his belittling of the South Korean president, Mr. Moon Jae-in, by calling him an appeaser vis-a-vis inter-Korean relations, South Korea's relations with North Korea. So he has still a long, long way to travel in Asia. And then, of course, he will round out his trip with his new buddy, Mr. Duterte, in the Philippines. So he's starting out with a good friend, and he wants to end on a good note in a country where someone who basically is like a thug is running the country.
So interesting bookends there. James Dorsey, what do you make of this trip, the duration and the ultimate aim here?
I would argue that I would agree with the two previous speakers, but I would argue that there is both a domestic message, as my colleague in Boston described, but there's also an Asian message. It is a message of support and alliance to U.S. allies in the region. It's a message to North Korea. I think the issues here are that we're dealing with different Donald Trumps, if you wish. There's a Donald Trump who is bombastic in his speech, who is personal in terms of his criticisms of others and his attacks. But there's also the Donald Trump who, despite what he says, allows his cabinet ministers, primarily his secretaries of defense and state, to pursue policies that are less aggressive.
Okay, picking up on that point about allowing people to pursue policies, allowing the military to take decisions into their own hands. We heard that the Pentagon released a statement, Einar, that a full-scale ground invasion is the only way to end the arsenal launches coming from North Korea. I mean, is that what the region is preparing for? Have you been told about that?
Well, I don't think that is a realistic thing. What you're talking about logistically would be very, very difficult. If you go back to Desert Storm and you see how long it took to mount an offensive, a full-scale invasion, the number of troops, the backup support, the tanks, everything involved, this is not something you're going to do over a fortnight, not even a month. This would take months, if not 6 months, to try to put together. I think this is just part of this kind of badminton game that good Trump is playing with the other Trump, saying that, you know, on one hand, I'm reasonable, I'll listen to Mattis unless I fire him. And on the other hand, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. He's ratcheted up rhetoric, and by doing so, increased the tensions, and he's using that as a leverage point in order, what I think his real agenda is, and I agree with my colleague in Boston, that this is simply a way of getting trade concessions, which he can then take back to the people of the United States and see, here I am, the great deal maker.
Because, Katherine, if there were to be an attack on North Korea, then the victims would be Japan and South Korea.
Absolutely. And South Korea's President Moon Jae-in has made it clear on several occasions publicly that the U.S. cannot and must not commit any kind of military intervention on the peninsula without the consent of the South Korean people. Now, one could say that that's just a rhetorical demand, but nevertheless, it is the South Koreans who will face the brunt of any kind of military intervention. I just want to add this, that I find it interesting. One of our speakers said that there are multiple Trumps, or at least 2 Trumps. And indeed, in Japan, Mr. Trump met with Japanese families of abductees, people who were taken by North Korea in the 70s and 80s and have not been able to rejoin their families in Japan, and some of them may have indeed died in North Korea. So when he met with the families of the abductees, he included this statement, which is really interesting. He said that it would be a tremendous signal, and I'm reading here his words, if North Korea would send them back, and that would be the, quote, start of something very, very special. Typical Trump language, but again, an unexpected possible olive branch. The only problem is with Mr. Trump that even if he says something that is non-escalatory, any day, any moment, he could send a Twitter storm out raising that rhetoric or raising the bar. So we don't know how stable and predictable his words can be, and I'm afraid that Asian nations actually read him the same way.
James, I'm wondering how his tweets play out in your studies and when it comes to putting policy together and the sort of conversations that all these leaders are having ahead of Trump's visit and sitting down talking to them.
Well, I think there's several things here. One is his unpredictability, and that's something that he wants. I think that part of his unpredictability is by design, and part of it is by character. What I also think is that Donald Trump does not want to be engaged in a major ground war, a third war after Iraq and now and alongside Afghanistan. What I think we're seeing is a strategy in which he is blistering and threatening and aggressive. And that's a strategy that so far has failed to impress the North Koreans, nor it has worried some of its allies. It hasn't really impressed the Chinese, to the best of my knowledge. But at the same time, let's face it, yes, a lot of this is about trade, but the United States is a Pacific power. It does have interests in the region. A nuclear North Korea is an issue it has to come to grips with. And my suspicion is that what he's trying to do is ratchet up sanctions in a way that over whatever period of time, he can force North Korea on its knees, whether that succeeds or not being a second issue. And at the same time, he is preparing for a military option, but that's his least favorite option.
What will the conversation be, Einar, when he goes over to China? Will we see a push for more sanctions? I mean, there's talk about targeting countries that sell North Korea's weapons, which bring in a large amount of money to North Korea. I mean, is that the sort of conversation that will be pushed as opposed to military confrontation, possibly?
Well, quite frankly, it's very difficult to see whether you're going to get Jekyll or Hyde when he arrives in Beijing. I think a lot of it, from the Chinese perspective, is going to be welcoming him in, giving him the big kind of grandiose welcome and feting him at great length. And this goes a long way towards getting into Donald Trump's good books. What he does from there, very unknown. He's left his China hawks at home, but he's still they're still very vocal in what they're saying. Bannon is on the sidelines screaming that China is the enemy and they need to be dealt with. Meanwhile, it's just very unclear which side of his cabinet he's with at any particular time. As Katherine said in Boston, in one moment he's saying something conciliatory. For instance, he said, I'd be willing to meet with anybody. That would be a good start. And then at the next moment, he's saying that they have to be dealt with. Little Rocket Man, all this kind of stuff.
Maybe we should deal with Katherine, and maybe you've got some thoughts on this, the Indo-Pacific policy that they're talking about. What is this policy? Is it a strategy? What should we envision when they talk about that?
That's a very good question, because this has come out of thin air as far as it coming from the White House. In truth, the United States does not, I repeat, does not have an Indo-Pacific strategy. The whole notion came from the Japanese. So it is a Japanese idea, and they have been studying this for quite some time. It is an idea to get a consortium of democracies in East Asia going as a way to contain China. So primarily consisting of Japan, Australia, India, the United States. And this is not, for example, a replacement or a surrogate for TPP, which some people think it could be. I absolutely would disagree with that. There is not much content there. I do want to add something about Trump's visit to China that is upcoming. What is interesting is that everybody is pretty sure he will not pick on the South China Seas issue with the Chinese, and it is not an issue he particularly cares about, at least in public. But the fact that he's going to Vietnam, and not only for the APEC meeting, but also will go have a bilateral with the president of Vietnam in Hanoi, which is symbolic. I think that is a way to give assurance to Southeast Asians, to the ASEAN members, that the U.S. understands their concern about China, even if they're very friendly with China on trade issues, and that freedom of navigation of the South China Seas is something that is very important on the U.S.'s foreign policy agenda for East Asia. So in that sense, I think it is a smart move not to raise it in terms of temperature, but to at least show up where the countries care about freedom of navigation.
Yeah, James, it's a real balancing act here, isn't it? I mean, you're pursuing a policy that basically pushes China away. Donald Trump needs China. They both need each other. But we've got Xi Jinping on a high now after election victories there in that country. We've got Abe on a high. I'm wondering where this leaves Donald Trump's leverage and his negotiating power with all of these nations.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, in a sense, I think what we're dealing with is a Donald Trump for whom the concept of America's role in the world is still evolving. I think the concept that he had when he was on the campaign trail and before he entered the Oval Office, and the concept that he has had or seen change since he entered the Oval Office is still a process in motion. And that part of this trip is in many ways going to define that. I think it's absolutely true that he doesn't have a strategy, and that reduces his leverage. He's very much someone who is issues-oriented, very much someone who's sensitive, as one of the speakers said earlier, of how he is treated. And if he is treated with the proper respect and with the proper recognition, then he is more amenable. So I think a lot of that is indeed going to play out in Beijing. But I also think that one of the things that Trump is realizing is the United States has strategic interests in Asia, whether it's trade, whether it's security, whether it's America's place in the world. All of those things come together in Asia. And so Trump has to come to grips with Asia, whether he really wants to or not.
And Einar, I guess it's important at this time when geopolitically the US has been weakened. I mean, look at them pulling out of the Middle East, for example. So many areas where they've lost dominance. Is this a region, an area that they can still claim a strong footprint?
Jane, that's a real question. A lot of it will depend on these kind of how much heat they're able to generate among ASEAN nations about freedom of navigation. Now, I believe that this is spurious. China has absolute interest in maintaining clear seaways, 2.3 trillion in trade, and also they have to import their resources. So I think this is rather fallacious. The issue here is, what is the U.S. offering? I mean, right now, Donald Trump has gotten concessions from Japan. He's going to be looking for concessions from South Korea. But what is he putting on the table other than, quote, I'm your security blanket? So this is why I said earlier, he's using security as a blunt instrument to get what he wants in terms of trade. I don't think that this is a long-term alternative. When you start creating uncertainty, this is the anathema of both business and diplomacy. You cannot formulate policies if you don't know what the other side is doing. So I think in the end, this backfires for him.
And Katherine, it seems that there is a delicate balance that works in that region. So empowering somebody like Abe, for example, with the promise of more troops in the region, Abe suggesting that he possibly will buy military hardware from the US, change the constitution. How much of a concern is all of that in this changing dynamic?
Well, I think we have to give the Asian leaders more credit than Trump may be willing to, because as much as Mr. Abe and others put on a good show for Trump's visit, they are, of course, they want to have good relations and stronger relations with the United States, but it's for their own national interest. It has nothing to do with making Trump happy. At the same time, what's interesting right now is because the Asians are wary of the general U.S. commitment to Asia under Trump, Japan and India are throwing around the idea of a military alliance, which would be allied against China. That would be a major game changer in the region. At the same time, Japan and China are actively, in recent weeks, improving their relationship and making it very explicitly public. So that's a good thing, but they are basically playing multiple games. And then, of course, South Korea and China, on the eve of Mr. Trump's visit to Asia, made friends. They reconciled on the issue of THAAD, the U.S. Missile defense system that is placed in Korea, which the Chinese were very, very adamantly opposed to. Now the Chinese and South Koreans have come to terms, and they are getting back on track in terms of a good relationship. So the Asian countries are maneuvering to basically make sure they have Plan B, Plan C, in case the U.S. is not a reliable partner. If I may add, there's also the reality that this trip is in a way a bit of a waste, especially of the U.S. taxpayer money and of opportunities, because I think we need to think about the issues that will not be raised. For example, the fact that South Koreans want to develop their own domestic nuclear arsenal, which would be a major slap in the face against U.S. non-proliferation efforts and increase in arms race in East Asia. The fact that Japan, with Mr. Abe's triumphant re-election recently, wants to change the peace constitution. That would be a serious changing of the post-World War II security arrangements and assumptions in East Asia. And there are other issues like that, which I know that Mr. Trump is not only unwilling to raise, but frankly, I don't think he's capable of addressing these very complex issues.
James, I'm wondering what would be considered a success after this trip for the US administration and for all the countries involved. What would they be looking for?
I mean, I think in an ideal world, if Trump would get what he wants, and I doubt that, it would be a far stronger consensus in action rather than just word on North Korea. And it would be what he calls fair and reciprocal trade relations. I don't think he's going to get that, but that would be the ideal outcome for him. So it really depends to what degree he gets at least some movement in that direction. I don't think that the equation is simply security for trade. I think that there is a sincere interest in the security of U.S. allies in the region. But I think at the same time, he is and will be demanding that what he views as unfavorable trade terms be revised. And we've seen no indication of that yet. We've seen some paying of lip service in Japan.
All right, all three of you, thank you very much for wrapping up that talk for us. Einar Tangen, James Dorsey and Katherine Moon. Good to chat to you. And thank you very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. You can find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. Mine is at Jane Dutton. And from me and the rest of the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.